Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. My name is Heidi Ashton Yoon. I am the Outreach Coordinator and Partnerships Coordinator here in the Children and Teens Department. It's a pleasure to have everyone here tonight. What a nice full house. Thank you. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones, just in case you have them on. No, I always forget. And at the end of tonight's presentation, we will take questions from the audience, so be thinking about those, and there will be a book signing following the discussion. I'll give more directions about that after the Q&A. Now on to introductions. Patricia Park was born and raised in Queens, New York, graduated from the Bronx High School of Science, Swarthmore College, and received her MFA from Boston University. She's an assistant professor of creative writing at American University. All right, woo, go Eagles! A Fulbright Scholar in Creative Arts, a Jerome Hill Artist Fellow, and the author of the acclaimed adult novel, Read Jane, a reimagining of Bronte's Jane Eyre. Imposter Syndrome and Other Confessions of Alejandra Kim is her debut YA novel. In conversation...
So I can pretend to feel popular.
In conversation with Patricia tonight is Dolen Perkins-Valdez. She is the New York Times bestselling author of Wench, Balm, and most recently Take My Hand. Take My Hand was named a most anticipated book of 2022 by Newsweek, San Francisco Chronicle, Essence, and NBC News. And as of today, it was announced that she was the 2023 NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work. Dolen is the current chair of the board of the Penn Faulkner Foundation, and it is my pleasure to turn the event over to them.
Oh my gosh. Hang on. Is this on? Hey. Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you all so much for coming. So many familiar faces. We have the AU community and friends from afar. So thank you so much for coming. Can we just give Dolen another round of applause for the NAACP Fiction Award? She's right up there with Beyonce, Trevor Noah, Stacey Abrams, Lizzo. We could go on.
But this is your night, Patty.
I'm having imposter syndrome, like sharing the stage with you.
We're all imposters.
So I thought I would read just a little bit from the opening of the book, and then Dolen and I will be in conversation, and then we'll do a Q&A afterwards. I'm going to just stand because I don't know. I'm told that that's better I used to study singing, so you're supposed to stand, right? Something about the esophagus? I don't know.
And we get to see your pretty dress,
Oh,
too.
thanks.
I love it.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you for all your kind and friendly and welcoming faces. So thank you. I know everybody could be doing other things this evening, but thanks for coming. So this is the opening of Imposter Syndrome and Other Confessions of Alejandra Kim. When you have a name like Alejandra Kim, teachers always stare at you like you're a typo on the attendance sheet. Each school year, without fail, they look at my face and the roster and back again, like they can't compute my super Korean face and my super Spanish first name. Multiply that by 8 periods a day, and boom, welcome to my life at Quaker Oats Prep. I mean, Alejandra is like the Jessica of Spanish girl names. Basic as all hell. It's not like my parents named me Edmina Hilda or Xochitl. And yet still, people find 1,000,001 ways to butcher my name. I've been called Alejandra. Mr. Landibido, our college guidance counselor, who apparently never took Spanish 101. Hello, the J is pronounced like an H. Alexandra, Mr. Schwartz, sophomore year, who ironically Ellis Islanded me, even though he teaches US history. Not a good move, Mr. Schwartz. Alejandra, Ms. Sanders, junior year physics. Technically, this is correct. The third syllable is pronounced like the Chan in Chanukah. Chanukah? Hanukkah? You get my point. But Ms. Sanders was trying so hard to sound muy auténtica, which was almost as bad as if she just Ellis Islanded my name in the first place. You know, like those annoying people who go to the bodega and order a croissant when the rest of us commoners just say croissant? But if you're the one ordering croissants from a corner bodega, then that's the least of your pretentious problems. For the record, I just pronounce it Alejandra, but I usually tell people to call me Allie. I say it the easy gringo way, as in alley cat, alleyway, back alley. That's what everyone at Quaker Oats Prep calls me. Our school's not actually named Quaker Oats. It's officially an austere preparatory school named after a Quaker from the 1600s who was literally burned at the stake for trying to better humanity. But everyone just calls us Quaker Oats. We're not like Brearley or Chapin or Dalton. We're more progressive, read hippie and weirdo. These are air quotes. We're like the minor leagues for the big Quaker colleges like Wyder and Swarthmore and Bryn Mawr. Any Swatties out here? Yeah, a few of us. Woo. Laurel Greenblatt Watkins, my first and best friend here, says we're a hotbed of granola crunchiness in the middle of Chinatown. I don't know what to think. I'm just a scholarship kid, 90%. And Ma never lets me forget about the 10% we owe each year. Back in my neighborhood in Queens, they call me Ale. Except when Ma gets super pissed, then it's all, Alejandra Verónica Kim, andate a tu cuarto. If I were Dominican or Puerto Rican or Colombian or Mexican, then at least I'd have some solidarity with mi gente, my people, which might sound vaguely racist, but it is what it is. But my parents are Argentine, and there aren't a whole lot of us here. Both sets of my parents' parents were Korean immigrants who were aiming for America North back in the day, but washed up in America South. Sidebar, the Korean name for America is Migook, beautiful country. For South America, it's Nammi, south of beautiful, which is all kinds of linguistically messed up. It sounds random how a bunch of Koreans ended up in Argentina. The short answer is immigrant exploitation. They were sent over to farm and populate Patagonia, but the land was basically a barren desert. The Koreans were like, yeah, nope, and hightailed it back to Buenos Aires, where they settled in a villa miseria called Pekku and sewed clothes all day. Every time I get upset about something first world, like how they forgot the ketchup packet with my fries, I have to stop and remember, Papi grew up in literal Miseryville. He worked in a sweatshop, forced into child labor by his own parents. That's what happens when you're the kid of immigrants. Your whole life is one big guilt trip. Nothing about my family is normal, not even the Spanish we speak, which is all weird and porteño, AKA Buen Aryan. Apparently there's a hierarchy within the Latinx community where everyone thinks Argentines are snobby, white, European wannabes looking down the noses at the rest of Latin America with their hoity-toity accents and weirder verb conjugations and stubborn refusal to use normal words like tú, you. Instead, Argentines say vos, which was super trending in Spain in the 1500s, but has since fallen the way of the payphone and the postage stamp. Also, Argentines use the word che, hey, a lot, which is how Ernesto Guevara got his nickname, Che Guevara. Anyway, Ma and Papi knew each other as kids in Pekku, and they re-met here in New York as adults. And the rest, as they say, is historia. Che, that was exhausting. What's kind of annoying is how people, adults especially, always expect you to lead with your origin story like you're a Marvel comic, sans the superpowers. They're like, ooh, tell me the exotic story behind your name, face, race, peoples. Walk me through that radioactive spider bite that transformed you into the super freak you are today. Peter Parker, by the way, is also from Queens. I'm 94.7% sure they wouldn't do that if I looked like my ancestors had stepped off the Mayflower. Thanks.
We do have a couple of chairs. I don't know if anybody wants to come sneak up here.
Yeah, Sachi, hi.
We have one right down here up front.
Hello, come grab it. And then there's two more here as well. And two more. Hi. There's one way up here in the front. Judy, you want to sit here? You can take the front row. Judy's from Queens too. We went to high school.
Yay, Queens in the house! All right.
Sorry. This is my own Remembering a wonderful night on a bad writing day. Yeah.
I
Thank you.
always wish I had done that. I'm so glad you're doing that.
I see other writers, I'm like, oh, they don't do the self, they like take a picture of the audience so that you can remember.
the one awkward moment is worth it later, right? When you
Yeah.
have your
When I'm like, can I?
So I was going to start with one other question, but because you've read that wonderful first chapter, I want to start with asking you about your own family history. Like, I was just curious. I mean, we work together, and I don't know a whole lot. I've met your beautiful parents. I remember you brought them to my office. But does your family have a connection to Argentina?
Well, in the year 1965, there was a change to. It's so fascinating because people are like, what? They're like Asian people in Latin America. They're Koreans from Argentina, and at its peak, the community was 50,000, and it has since dwindled to about half. And there was this change to the trade law. Oh my gosh! Now I'm gonna get to the boring stuff. So my family, it was this kind of loophole, right, to get from to get to America, because everyone's eyes were on the prize, America or bust. But at the time that my parents left Korea in the 60s, it was hard to get there directly. So they took the slow boat for 2 months separately to Argentina, and they worked there. My father went shortly after to New York, and my mother's family stayed there for longer. My mother supported the family. She was in her late teens. She knitted sweaters and lived in the kind of Korean ghetto, Spanish word ghetto, in Buenos Aires. So it's so fascinating. I have cousins named like Marcos, Song, Marcela, Verónica Alejandra. Actually, I have a cousin named Verónica Alejandra Park, so a cousin named Pablo. We always just grew up calling him Pablo, and I'm like, oh, actually, your real name is Paul, I guess. Yeah. Pablo Kim, yeah. So
Your Spanish is very good.
Oh, thank
Your
you.
accent is very good.
Oh, I sent myself to Middlebury College. They have that Spanish. They have like a summer language institute, and I did this when I was doing research. You're there for almost 2 months, and you take a language pledge that you will not read, write, or speak any other language but that language you're there to study. So you're in the middle of like Bumblebee, Vermont, right? And then you're doing this.
Laurel in the book goes and studies Arabic or something at one of those camps.
Yeah. Philip, did you go too? Well, you know that pain. I'm like, oh.
She comes back and she says she has solidarity with Muslim women now or something.
Yeah, she, good on her. But I mean, I'm a New York City public school kid, so I took my Spanish, and then I took AP Spanish, and all of. Oh, thank you, Judy. When you're in class with like native speakers, you gotta keep up somehow, or else you're gonna flunk the AP test. Oh, yeah. Anyway.
Very good. So, let's go back to my original opening question, and we can
Yes.
come back to all of that good stuff. But what has it been like to shift? I've read your first book. I was sitting in my office when we first got hired together, and I was going through emotional. Y'all got to read the first book too. It's so good. At Read Jane. So I was sitting there and loving it. Tell me about the shift to YA and how that felt for you, and what's different about writing YA.
Well, I mean, the part of the inspiration to move to the genre was my AU students. I'm looking at so many of you.
Lots of
Thank you. Our students were coming to us. They're like, we want to write YA. And we read YA, we want to write it. And I'm like, as an educator, I had to figure out, how am I going to do that? So I taught myself, and I started with their recs. I've been at AU, this is my 6th year, so I've, had some time. And I taught myself the conventions of the craft, but I fell in love with this kind of freshness of voice and this immediacy of the experience. Hi, Ellis, who's also writing YA. And it was just, I felt like open and fresh and intimate, like an intimate experience on the page, the way that I haven't so much in the adult experience. But we can talk craft for a minute, especially since there's so many students here. I think one of the key differences is voice and immediacy of the experience. So I chose to write imposter syndrome in first person present verb tense to capture that kind of, oh my gosh, things are unfolding hot and fast. I don't even have time to process. Whereas in adult fiction, when you have teen characters, it's often, not always, but more often than not, written with like a kind of a retrospective narration in order to be like, well, that was that dumb thing I did then, but I know now because I'm a mature adult. I mean, with all due respect to adult fiction, you need that because, you know, and I think about that a lot, those kinds of craft decisions to, and what distinguishes YA and adult literature.
And you capture so well the self-centeredness of the teenager, right? Like, I mean, you literally could be like, the house is on fire, and they're still like, can you buy what's in my Amazon cart, you know? And that is one of the things that I love about Ale. You know, I love her as a character. She is vulnerable and raw and imperfect and ambitious, but also just a typical teenager. She's so, I mean, I really got her, I thought.
You know, and that's the really trying thing. I think the worst thing that you can do with YA or children's literature is when you talk down to the reader. And I have actually seen that work from other colleagues, other you know, from not actually so much with students, but actually other colleagues who are like, oh my God, I'm told I have a 17-year-old protagonist, I need to write, and I think. So then you have to, as a writer, you kind of have to create some kind of dramatic irony. You're like, okay, here's a 17-year-old going through this, you know, their world is crushing because it is this, the stakes are, right? And, you know, for those of you who studied with me, we just filled up a chalkboard, like, discussing stakes at the high school level. Like, what was high stakes for you when you were 17? And then we switch, what are high stakes for you now as an adult? And then that space in between is wonderful to explore in the literary terrain, and how much can you kind of lean into that dramatic irony where the writer knows, the reader knows, but the 17-year-old character may or may not know. So.
And how did you come up with the idea for this book? Was it something that had been percolating for a while?
You know, so all of my books are connected. It's the Papi Park multiverse. The trademarked here. There's a character from my first book, Read Jane, named Juan. He's like the stock boy at the uncle's grocery store, and he is Papi in Imposter syndrome. So I was really interested in this Korean Argentine family that comes to settle in Queens, and I was researching their story, and I was just trying to find ways to access that family. So I'd written swaths from different characters' points of view, and once I struck on Ala's voice, there was something so, and maybe it's the teenager in them, the self-centered, whatever it was, something just opened up. Like, the voice was so American in a way that the other chapters I was writing, maybe because I was channeling some of like the Latin American and specifically like Argentine literary traditions, she was just like, all right, I'm gonna tell you my story. Like, this is how it is. I'm gonna be real. You know, I'm from Jackson Heights, Queens. This is my life. And then that's how the story opened up for me.
And how much research did you have to do? I mean, you just mentioned like Argentine literature and things like that. I'm just, I felt really, I trusted you. Like like you said in the opening chapter, you understood like the hierarchy among Latin American countries and how people look at Argentinians. The Spanish was perfect. And, you know, sometimes you can tell when people have Spanish in their book and it feels like they used Google Translate.
Yeah.
You did not use Google Translate. Like, this is real. This is real life Spanish. And then also just everything that, you know, there are like mock college application letters. And, you know, there's just so much there that's so rich that you make look effortless. But I know as a writer, you worked really hard to do. So tell me how much research you did.
Oh, I did a few research trips to Argentina. As I said, I taught myself Argentine Spanish, and then I continued Middlebury's grad school in Buenos Aires, excuse me, for a second summer. And I went and researched. I was in the Korean community in Buenos Aires. I conducted a number of interviews. I just inserted myself. I'm like, hey, I'm like this Korean American from America. My family used to live here. Can I go to church with you? Can I come work in your like textile shop? And I did, and I was like folding all the clothes wrong, and they're like, oh, honey. And I'm like, lo siento. But I think as writers, right, it's so cliched to say like, tip of the iceberg. But I really do feel that you need to know this much in order to just have one line. But it's also my imposter syndrome, right? Like I feel like I need to know something 95% in order to write anything with even like 30% authority. But I have colleagues who are like, oh, I just read this one article, like I skimmed this one article, and then I wrote a book about it. I'm like, ah! I mean, good for you, not inside I'm But I'm like, oh my God, that's so great.
You bring me to the title, Imposter Syndrome, and I was telling you back in the green room that the reason I write is because I was feeling that with my first creative writing job, which I got without a book, I had like 2 published short stories, and after I got the job, I was telling my close friends, like, I better write a book before they find out that I'm faking it and conning them. And so I like worked really hard to write a book because I had imposter syndrome. So I wanted to ask you, what is imposter syndrome to you? Like, how do you think about it?
I remember the moment where the first time somebody told me, like, oh, you have imposter syndrome. And I'm like, what is this term? Like, oh, is that what people are saying? And then it just struck me. I'm like, oh, I do. I do. One example that I can give that I feel like I drew from and it helped inspire parts of imposter syndrome is when I left New York City, I went to Bronx Science, which is a very different kind of a school. And then I went to Swarthmore, which, again, we have some Swaties here. And I felt like I was like an alien on another planet. For one, just the way that we speak. Like in New York, it's like time is money. Come on, like chop chop. But at Swarthmore, people are like, and then according to these post-structural, socioeconomic, and it's like 5 paragraphs, and I'm like, what are you saying? Like, so even the treatment of language, this kind of, I remember like being shut down in a workshop, and it wasn't because I like said F you or said something bad. She was like, she cut me in the worst way. She's like, oh, I don't know what you mean by that essentialist construct. And I'm like, I don't even know what that means. We're just talking about Huck Finn. And I was like made so small in that moment. So these are the kinds of moments that I felt imposter syndrome. And I feel like as we graduate, and we were chatting a little bit about this before, I think I'd like to think as like a fully grown woman that I've left it behind, but I think that it's just that you keep striving, right? So the stakes get higher. So the same thing that would have made you like get into sweats 10 years ago won't now. Awesome, imposter syndrome cured, maybe, but then something else will happen. But there are new conversations around imposter syndrome now. When I started writing it, it was one, and as I was finishing the book, actually, there's a lot of conversations, and I address this in the end of imposter syndrome, that a lot of times we tell BIPOC women, especially BIPOC girls, you have imposter syndrome. And now there's this resistance. Like, I was told I had it by a white person. Not that, but that's who told me. I'm just relaying facts. And and by the end, I'm like, oh, can we just please, like, make this term obsolete? So I guess if I have any wish with my book, Imposter Syndrome, for the teens and hopefully the adults as well that read it, it's that, can we just do away with this term and kind of all graduate from imposter syndrome?
And the opposite I don't want either. I don't want to be the smartest person in the room either, right? I want to be in a room where there are people who are smarter and more accomplished. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. It shouldn't be a bad thing. Where are we on time? I want to make sure. Okay. 5 more minutes. Okay. Well, let's talk about another term that's used throughout the book. It's a lot of reference to woke culture here. And I think that's something that's really going to resonate with my teenager who wants to read your book, who's asking me, where do you think we are culturally on this notion of wokeness? Because I've heard it from the beginning, and then it's morphed into this sort of conservative negative thing, and now it's like, where are we with that?
Oh my gosh, if I'm quoted as saying anything today, like tomorrow, it's going to change. I had an NPR interview that I taped yesterday that aired today, and we talked about this question of wokeness, and what we talked about was like the performative aspect of it. I can only tell you from my experience and Ala's experience, because I made Ala up, so I can speak to her experience, is that for me, I think for me as a BIPOC woman, as a Korean American who grew up in Queens, I can tell when something feels fake and when it doesn't. I think where something feels authentic or it doesn't. So there's this one moment in the book with Ale where there's a lot of performative wokeness happening. Like there's like an assembly that's put on and so forth. And she's like, you know what would be awesome is if like I'm on the subway and someone calls me the C word, and if someone could just kind of like speak out or be an ally there, versus like the slacktivist kind of performing of it. So that's her kind of way of feeling seen, and I think for me, I feel that way too. And she shows moments of people who are like being not PC, and she's like, hey, you know, at least they have good intent. You know, she's trying to see the humanity and the good intentions of it. So I really do feel for all of us in this moment, like we're navigating, what is, you know, are we being allies? Are we not? How are we amplifying? Are we being woke? Or are you allowed to say woke anymore? Like we can say BIPOC now, but next year, what can we say? Are we? And there's even like parody about it. These girls in the bathroom are like, oh, what do you say? So I don't know. I think we're just all in it together, and hopefully through Allah's journey, like that's one story towards finding some kind of I don't know, meaning and in navigating this moment.
Yeah, I love how you really think through ideas about allyship and what it really means to be an ally here, right? And it's complicated because her, you know, Laurel is her good friend and is very close to her, but Laurel's got some self-examination to do too, you know? And, you know, it's very clear here that what Ale needs is for her ally to stand up for her in that moment. Not to just speak to being an ally, but like you said, if somebody says something to me on the subway, in that moment, you stand up for me. And after, you know, this microaggression happens to her by the teacher, then after the moment, people are coming up saying, oh, that's so terrible that that happened to you. But in the moment, they said nothing. That really hit me emotionally. I felt for her.
No, thank
She's
you.
a wonderful character.
And Dolen, like I feel like we can just talk on and on, like about all those moments that we've had that same thing happening right in the classroom, and just seeing it repeated maybe in the next generation and so forth. I don't know. I will say though that all of these characters, Laurel included, they're like in their senior year of high school, so they're applying for colleges. Some of them are applying early to their dream colleges. So the stakes for them feel so high. And imagine that stress, right? When you were that age, like where am I gonna get it? And then your self-worth is tied to that yay or nay. But I will also say that I think it's important. I actually had a lot of white sensitivity readers read for, believe it or not. I had sensitivity readers for all of. I know, right? I feel like, you know, it's important to get everybody right. So I had all sensitivity readers. I have a minor character who is Dominican American, so I had a sensitivity reader for that character, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I think it's important, and I think you know, whatever actions are taken in the novel, or whatever snapshot we're seeing of these characters, you know, I hope we can, you know, they'll grow up and they'll look back and they'll be like, oh, you know, I had to go through that moment to be who I am today. Just like us looking back when we were 17.
Well, let's open it up to questions from the audience.
Hey, Ellis.
I just had a quick question. Firstly, it was so great hearing Alejandra's voice. I thought it's so engaging, and I was wondering if you could talk about your process in creating that voice. How much of Alejandra did you have to know before you put pen to paper? And also, can you talk about how easy or hard it was to switch that voice on and off, you know, when you're done writing, and then you have to get back to that voice again?
Yeah, no. Sure, that's a great question, Ellis. This question was, how much of the character of Alejandra did I know before I started writing? And as I'm writing, you know, how much am I able to turn that voice on and off and all of that? I will say, I wish I brought my outtakes file, because for some talks, I have like every first sentence like of different drafts of this novel. And, you know, because I kept playing around with Alejandra's age, I'm like, oh, maybe she should be at college, so then her voice, she was using more elevated diction, right? And then I was like, hey, you know, maybe it's more middle grade. One line that I do remember that was in the drafts, the outtakes file was, when you have a name like Alejandra Kim, the teachers always stare at you like you're a clerical error. And imagine I don't know, like that's like my language from having worked in corporate America, right? So I don't know how many 17-year-olds, and at that time, that was when I was fiddling with an even younger voice. Like I had an 11-year-old niece who was vetting that line. She's like, "What does clerical mean?" And I'm like, "Oh, I have failed you." So that line didn't make it. So in that regard, you're always still playing with the language, right? And it will continue on and on. Like that line I read about postage stamps and payphones, referring to the obscurity of this Spanish term vos. Even my editor, she's like, "Are kids saying postage? Do they know what a postage stamp is?" So then I had to run to class. That time I was teaching a lot of fresh people, first years. They call them fresh people in the book. So I can't use the wrong term. And I'm like, "Do you know what these things are? Do you know what a payphone is?" They're like, "Yes, we've heard of these things." And I'm like, "Okay." I'm like, "Okay." But yeah, in terms of the character, Ellis, I think it's twofold. Like you have to know them to some degree, but you're also putting them through these trials and tribulations. So you're crafting these scenes, and you might be like, "All right, this is what's gonna happen. All right, Alejandra, listen up. This is what I'm gonna put you through. I'm gonna put you in front of this fountain in this park. You're gonna have this conversation," and you'll write it that way, and then suddenly that character will loosen up or resist and be like, "No, I got other ideas for you." And then they start to, so as you're revising back and forth, so it's a continual process. But yeah, I'm curious, Dolen, for you, how do you access your characters? Like, how much of your character do you know before you put pen to paper?
Well, I will say that I think that's the one thing you can't rush. Like you can rush a lot of things, like even, as an experienced writer, but character takes time. And so it's interesting that you have an outtakes drawer as you were trying to really nail it, because I feel like it takes that. I do spend a lot of time. I'm not a voicey writer. I'm not I don't think of myself as a voicey writer, but I do spend some time trying to get the language right. Like, what's the language of this story? And that's kind of my version of what you're saying. But I'm interested that you said it was really important to know her age. Because sometimes when I read, student YA fiction, they haven't really landed the age. And it changes, what's important to you. I was thinking about when you said, when they're so, what college they get into. My daughter's high school, they have an Instagram page where they announce the colleges on there. I don't know if y'all have seen this. And they watch that thing so closely. Like, we'll be at dinner and she'll be like, "Such and such got into Swarthmore." And I'm like, "Who? I don't even know these people." But they watch it every single day. And I feel I don't know, I feel some kind of way about that.
Yeah, I mean, remember, right? Doesn't it give you PTSD from your high school scene? And I remember we didn't, no. But it was so and there was so much sizing up, right? Oh my God, they only got this on their SATs. How did they get it? What was their GPA? Wait, I had honors bio with them, and they didn't turn in that paper, that lab, and then it becomes so fraught. But step back, 10 years later, I don't even remember. Judy, do you remember any of that? No.
I do remember there was a big board with all of our pictures where they put up where we went to school.
Yeah, and we were encouraged to wear our sweatshirts for that college.
That was early Instagram.
It was early Instagram. I know, it was the original Facebook. It was here's my face. I totally I was trying to bury that. Whatever, I got in early to Swarthmore, so I was fine. Just kidding. I'm such a jerk. Sorry. I almost didn't. I almost thought I didn't anyway. Yes. Hey, Manny.
So it's not fair to ask for, say, a favorite, right? Because you've written this book, you put a lot of love into it. But maybe what part was the most fun for you to write? What aspect or section?
Alejandra has this best friend from her neighborhood called Billy Diaz. He's Guillermo, but he goes by Billy. And sometimes they hang out in this park, Maria Inez Montoya Park, which has a fountain that doesn't work and it's filled with trash. And they sit in this bench and they just talk about life. And sometimes she decompresses. So Ella's continually code switching between her best friend Laurel at Quaker Oats and then her best friend Billy back in Jackson Heights. And he like puts her in her place sometimes. Because one time he's like, oh yeah, you know, blah, 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 like that Spanish person. And she gives him a look. And he's like, sorry, Latino. And then she gives him another look. He's like, okay, Latinx. You know, and then he says, look, I don't go to your fancy, you know, prep school. Like, I don't know the PC lingo. And I think there's a real moment there where the irony, for one, of a BIPOC person using the wrong terminology to describe themselves. So there's like satirical kind of, you know, milkage, I guess. But also just this weird moment. And then he's kind of checking her. He's like, look, we're in Queens. Like, you can shed that kind of, that, exactly. And it's, so that just goes to show, like, wokeness on any level, wokeness on the same day, but in a different neighborhood, a few subway, you know, you take the 7 train down and then it's a different kind of a level. So it's really confusing out there, folks, yeah.
Hi, maybe the inverse of that question, is there a scene or a part that was hardest to write that you find yourself working?
Okay. Okay. And to repeat the question, sorry, yeah, what was the hardest scene? The first, I forgot to repeat that question, was what was the easiest scene? The hardest scene to write. You know, I'm not good at party scenes, and I'm curious to hear from Dolen. I like putting 2 characters together and having them talk. You know, I'm like before sunset, before sunrise, Richard Linklater, like that kind of stuff all day long, right? And if I could have written just the whole book, like 2 characters talking, oh, that would be my dream. But parties, it's really hard. I mean, it's hard to host a party, let alone write one. So imagine like getting, you know, you've got one person arriving and then there's a whole room full of people. And how much do you focus on any one person? If it's a film, at least the camera lens can capture all of that, right? And then it can zoom in. But as the writer, you are the camera lens, so you're like, and then there were 148 people in the room, and then how much do you zoom in? So I find like getting the characters entering stage left, exiting stage, you know, on and off stage, like that's really hard. And then these fractured conversations as well. And then you have to think about pacing, and is the reader following any of this? Yeah. What are some of the hardest scenes for you to write, Dolen?
I think definitely those big scenes are always hard. Grief scenes are hard. We were just talking about this in a thesis meeting the other day. How, you know, grief is, there's something inarticulate about grief. So it's hard sometimes to capture it on the page, right? Like, grief is not just crying. It's not just being angry. It's, you know, there's something really hard to even articulate about grief sometimes. And now you're trying to write about it, you know? So I find those scenes to be really hard for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I can
You have
hear
a
that.
memorial scene. And the way you do grief, I think, is really good here. Like, there's this one moment where Papi's empanadas are on display amidst all the sort of perfect Korean food. And one of the women pokes at it with her chopstick, and it bursts open. And I
That was symbolic.
It was symbolic because it's one of her memories of her dad's like messy sort of, you know, mixed up way of doing it. And she yells at the woman, and it like causes a scene. And that was grief to me.
Yeah, and she wouldn't have acted that way if it had not been, you know, this memorial for Papi. And but can I take a moment to talk about Korean empanadas? Because
Now that we're talking about food.
I know. Well, so my family would make these empanadas every year. My aunts would all get together, and it's like the Goya wrappers filled with Korean japchae noodles and ground beef and Spanish olives, and, you know, stir fried as parsley, and then it's deep fried. So I just grew up, I'm like, oh, these are like giant Korean mandu. Like, I didn't even know. I'm like, empanada, it could be Korean. You know, I don't know, empanada, you know. I wasn't sure. And then I went to Argentina on one of my research trips. Part of my research was like to eat through every empanada in the streets of Buenos Aires. And they don't make them like that. They are baked, for one, and they call them empanada criolla, which is like the original, the OG Argentine empanada, and it has like ground beef and it has parsley, but none of this japchae noodle business, none of this deep fry business. And I realized, Koreans actually, we don't have ovens, or we don't use ovens. So deep frying would have been the natural way to interpret these foods. And I looked at, when I was doing some of my research in the Villa Miseria of Pekgu, this kind of Korean community, a lot of the homes are just in the back of a shop. So they don't even have a proper kitchen. So they have like a hot plate, and that's your kitchen. So, how else would these Korean empanadas have been made? There's no like oven, there's no Viking oven, that you can go and put in, set it to 180 degrees Celsius. I don't know what 350 translates to. So that was one example. Yeah. I forgot what
Sounds yummy. I want to try it.
Yeah, you can come over for
I'm coming,
for
I'm
Christmas
coming.
sometime.
Is that when you make them at Christmas time?
Yeah. They're trying to rope my generation into making it. I'm like, oh, it's so much work.
A lot
It
of
takes
work.
like 5 hours.
Yes,
Yeah.
You have to take
Oh,
a
it's
nap
hard-boiled
and then wake up
eggs.
and they're still working.
Yeah, it's hard-boiled eggs, but you can't even use the yolk. You can only use the white. So you have to like boil up double the amount of eggs that you actually need. Oh, yeah. Sorry, this is the first world problem. Oh, making empanadas. Yeah.
Can't we just put it in the microwave?
Hi, Wesley.
What was your inspiration for making the book?
What was my inspiration for making the book? I think readers like you, Wesley, and readers, young readers out there who, I don't want to speak on your behalf, but I know for me when I was growing up, I felt lonely. I felt like, and I wasn't cool, I wasn't popular, like I didn't know how to do like the teased bangs, because that was what was trending when I was a kid. I didn't know how to do any of that. The cool girls at school were like nice to you one day and then they were mean to you the next. So for me, I found my comfort in reading books and reading stories and reading about other people who felt like they did not quite belong. And Ale, she does not quite belong. She was born in the States, but Koreans look at her, they're like, oh, you're like from Latin America. And then Latin Americans look at her and they're like, oh, you're China. And she's like, I'm not even Chinese. And then white Americans look at her another way. So it's just such a nebulous space, which means like confusing, like neither this nor that kind of a space. So I wrote the book for folks like that, for readers like you, and hopefully you'll feel a little less lonely if you read Imposter Syndrome. Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Oh.
What age group is that? And are they not reading adult literature?
According to my publisher, YA is ages 13 to 18. Middle grade is younger, I think 8 to 12, something like that. I actually think it's that the lines are blurring more. So I used to work for Random House back in the day, and at that time, YA as a genre did not even exist. I don't know if you all remember Marcus Zusak's The Book Thief. And that made such a sensation when it was published, but it was originally published, if I'm remembering correctly, in Australia as an adult book, but when it came to the States, it was published as YA. So even that shows you it's a kind of a weird market category, and I'm seeing since the time that I left publishing and started to teaching here, the genre has taken off, so I think there's a lot of blurring of the lines. And I feel like maybe that's what my students are responding to, that kind of, how can we capture the immediacy of an experience, but still address issues of social justice, which so much of YA is doing now. It used to be like unicorns and ponies, or wizards, whatever, or romance and the prom. But now it's about real social issues, and I'm just so excited that this genre is doing this. Sorry, I have to repeat after the fact. Yeah. I keep forgetting the prompt.
Well, I'll ask another question. Tell me about New York City in this book. I know in your previous book, Read Jane, New York was a character in the book, and it is here too. The way you talk about the train lines and, the way they are so mobile. I mean, this is one of the things I always envied about New York kids, that y'all can just go anywhere, right? Where I grew up, we had to get somebody to take us, Tell us about the importance of New York to Ale's experience and how you are thinking about place in your work these days.
Yeah, I think characters are born out of place. I just think about my New York isms. Like if you closed your eyes and didn't see what I look like and you heard me talk, like, okay, I don't say talk, I don't say coffee, but there's a kind of a speed to my speech. And I always say I'm waiting online. You never say you're waiting in line. I don't care what's grammatically correct. You're waiting on a line. Oh, sorry. Now I'm getting, yeah. And I say, yeah, waiting online. Cut out the, wait.
Is what you're saying.
I waited online to get my book, you know. I waited online to get my coffee, right? Yeah. Not I waited in line. I queued up. No. So I'm really interested in that. And Queens, you know, Queens is the stories are undertold and overlooked. Our literary legacy is in Gatsby, famously or infamously, right? We're called the Valley of Ashes. And it is a literal pit stop while Gatsby and the gang go from like the mansion parties on Long Island to the penthouse parties in Manhattan. So imagine being from the hometown, you know, it's like Wilson's gas station and the TJ Eckelberg sign. Like imagine if that's your hometown. You're like, you have a PR problem. We have a PR problem. And yeah, right, it hurts so much. I'm like, who, I mean, and then you have the King of Queens, which is just, you know. So when you come from a place that's part of a big city but is so overlooked, I'm interested in telling those stories and being like, look, you're not going to get the Times Square version of New York with my fiction. Sorry, but you're going to get real stories of real communities bumping up next to each other and just taking the trains, train delays. I think there's like train delays here too because it's very real. And yeah, that's what you'll get with my work. Hey, Kyle. Kyle's a wonderful poet in our MFA program.
I found Papi to be a really poignant and even sobering take on the immigrant parent, because you know at the same time that he is encouraging Ali to go chase her dreams, he's also the one reminding her, like, remember, you're a guest. Like, you know, you have to be on your P's and Q's, and like the almost impossibility of managing that messaging, I think, is sort of created a really great tension in the book. And I was just curious if you had anything else to say about what were your goals for the relationship between Papi and Ali in terms of what you wanted to communicate from the book.
No, thank you so much for saying that. Oh yeah. Yeah, what were my goals with Papi, and that it was an interesting take on the immigration experience. And so one thing that Papi says to Alejandra that actually my own parents said to me was, you know, you're a guest in this country. I'm like, I was born here. They're like, you're a guest. You know, we're guests. We're guests. So essentially, be on your best behavior. And, you know, I had a Times op-ed I wrote last year in response to all of this hate, anti-Asian hate. And, you know, I talk about how my parents would tell me to do that. Because when you're a minority, or when you're visibly a minority, people act, they treat you in a way, and you realize like you're on maybe borrowed time or like a borrowed seat. And so you feel like I've got to make myself small, right? I've got to like accommodate. So I was thinking a lot about that and their particular relationship. And this will be a tiny spoiler alert, but the novel does talk about a side concept called racial melancholia. And you know, and how much immigrants coming to the States, they carry this kind of trauma. Immigration itself could be this form of trauma. You know, when you're stripped of your culture, stripped of your language, stripped of, you know, you don't even know the right way to order a coffee or to walk in a space. Are you supposed to have your head down, head up? You know, what are you supposed to do? And it's kind of a slow trauma that eats away at you and produces this kind of a racial melancholia. I'm paraphrasing, but you know, I was thinking a lot about that and stories of my communities and, you know, happy stories, but also sad ones too. Yeah. Thank you, Kyle.
So sorry to end this here. Such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. Patricia and Dolen, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you. And NAACP Fiction, Image Fiction Award winner. And please. Yeah, thank you. But please support. I mean, Dolen is. take my hand, like what you're saying about women's rights and the amount of historical research you've done. I was blown away by this book and all of your works, but this is the most recent one. So please support Dolen as well. And thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Just some